The next testifier by Zoom is Mr. Clifton Otto. Mr. Otto, are you prepared to testify?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
You're welcome. Please proceed.
Well, thank you, Chair, members of the task force. Good afternoon. And by the way, happy National PTSD Awareness Day 2022. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on agenda item 2 regarding MPP's presentation on federal preemption as it applies to cannabis. MPP's position on federal preemption is well known because it's posted on their website. And it involves the fact that states have reserved the authority to decide how cannabis is used within the state, that states are not forcing people to violate federal law, and that the Rohrabacher-Farr appropriations rider that must be renewed each year by Congress provides some protections to programs and to patients. And while these findings are true, this approach to federal preemption is dangerous because it can create the impression that it's okay for states to create cannabis programs where patients and residents must violate federal law to participate, often without even knowing that they're violating federal law or being aware of the negative consequences that could befall them. I believe this is called entrapment. Our state needs to take action on this conflict with the federal regulation of marijuana. And when I say state, I'm referring to the executive branch. We cannot expect our patients and end users who are already violating federal law to incriminate themselves by approaching the DEA for a solution to this conflict. Fortunately, our state legislature has already taken action on this issue. So please do not insult our state lawmakers and their staff and their legal counsel by inferring that our legislature did not know what it was doing when both chambers unanimously adopted HCR 132 during the 2021 regular session. I'm available for any questions. Aloha.
Mr. Otto, thanks for taking the time. Task force members, any questions for Mr. Otto?
Yeah, this is Jim Ireland. I have a question. Excuse me.
Sure, please.
Can you just briefly, Mr. Otto, Dr. Otto, elaborate on just some potential solutions that would be available to this committee, remedies?
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? It might just be my computer.
Oh, no, we can hear you very clearly. Mr. Otto is on mute. He's trying to respond, but we cannot hear his answer to your question. It looks like he's having difficulty unmuting. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Ireland, for that question. I think that the task force does have certain actions before it that it can take because of the working groups that you have. And so this seems like a great opportunity for perhaps one working group in particular, or perhaps a additional working group that could look at this specifically. But what are the options available that the state could act upon? We already have one potential solution that our legislature unanimously adopted. So I think the point is we can't allow this conflict to continue. We cannot just sit back and wait for the federal government to come up with a solution. And it may be highly irresponsible to expand the state authorized use of cannabis without doing something at the state level about this issue at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Otto.
Okay, thank you. But really, at the end of the day, we are subject to the whim of the federal government if they're not going to change.
Well, so if the DEA is not going to cooperate, then it not only depends on the will of the DEA, but also the will of the state. How important is this to the state to protect our patients from all of the discrimination that is going on every day and destroying our patients' lives? If they had the will, and you know, maybe the DEA, if there was a solution that was brought to them, they could say, well, this is amazing. Somebody finally figured this out. There is a solution that could help relieve this conflict while perhaps a federal solution is also being worked on. But if they were to fight, then yes, there may need to be a response. And whether the state is willing to make that response, I guess would be something that they would have to look at. But I think that it's necessary to look at possible solutions, not look at whether it's going to fail or not, but at least come up with solutions that seem reasonable and put those to our state lawmakers next session so that they can reconsider those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the testifier?
Yes, Dr. Otto. So when the state recognized the medical use of cannabis back in 2000, shouldn't that have led to removal from the state's Controlled Substance Act? I mean, it no longer meets the criteria for qualifying as a Schedule I once you recognize the medicinal use. So is that part of what we're trying to do here?
Well, so the first part of that is our Uniform Controlled Substances is not the same as the Federal Controlled Substances Act, even though that's what was recommended by the Uniform Controlled Substances Commission. Our state changed the criteria for Schedule I controlled substances when it adopted our Uniform Controlled Substances Act. So there is no mention of accepted medical use. So so cannabis can stay in state Schedule I, and there is no conflict because our scheduling doesn't even consider accepted medical use. But I would also say that our Medical Use of Cannabis Act creates a state exemption for the medical use of cannabis. Some people will call it a carve-out. Because our patients are not subjected to the criminal penalties that are associated with the possession of cannabis as a state Schedule I controlled substance. So we already have a state exemption. A logical progression would be a federal exemption.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you, Doctor. Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Otto from the task force?
Terry Gorman, County of Maui. I do have a question for Dr. Otto. Dr. Otto, has any other state successfully enacted this kind of legislation that basically exempts the state from the Schedule I?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question, Terry. Currently, Iowa and Minnesota are both working on legislation to address this issue, and I'm happy to provide links to those pieces of legislature. Iowa has already sent a letter to the DEA requesting guarantees that federal funding will not be withheld from their schools and long-term care facilities, which are currently violating federal law because students, if they were allowed to use cannabis on campus, would be violating federal law. Residents in hospice would be violating federal law, and that could make it difficult for these places to get Medicare Part B reimbursement issue right now. And Iowa is currently waiting for a response from the DEA. There's also a petition from a resident in Iowa that is asking for a state exemption for their patients.
Thank you for that. As a member of the medical use PIG group, I'd be quite keen to follow progress on both of those initiatives, and if there are any other states that are making progress, because I agree with you, this is a huge issue for our registered patients here in Hawaii. Thank you, Dr. Otto.
Thank you.
I do have one more quick question.
Sure, please.
Is anyone familiar with the lawsuit that the ACLU has filed in the state of Nevada about they're trying to, I don't know, sue them to get cannabis out of the Schedule I drug category?
And I want to limit this question specifically to Dr. Otto. Dr. Otto, are you familiar with the litigation?
I'm not familiar with that litigation.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
Any other task force members? Dr. Otto has been very patient in answering a number of your questions. Anyone else have any questions? All right, seeing now, we're going to move to, thank you, Dr. Otto, very much. We're now going to move to Mr.